Welcome to In Via, the podcast where we're navigating the pilgrimage of life. We are all in Via, on the way, and we are learning a lot as we go. I'm your host, Joan Watson. Join me as we listen to stories, discover travel tips, and learn more about our Catholic faith. Along the way, we'll see that if God seeks to meet us in Jerusalem, Rome, or Santiago, He also wants to encounter you right there in your car, on your run, or in the middle of your workday. Did you read the Chronicles of Narnia as a child? If so, you're going to like today's episode. I'm chatting with Dr. Lenny DiLorenzo, a professor at the University of Notre Dame, author and editor of more than 10 books, including the book we're going to talk about today, Chronicles of Transformation, A Spiritual Journey with C.S. Lewis. Hi, Lenny.
Hi, Joan.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
Good. Very good, because I get to talk to you today.
Oh, that's nice.
So some of our listeners may not know you, which is sad for them. So do you want to start by telling us 3 sentences? I always limit people to 3, but I'm very generous.
Okay.
So 3 sentences about yourself. What would you tell people?
Yeah, go ahead and count them out for me as I go along. But I'd maybe just start by saying I'm from a little bit of everywhere, a little bit of nowhere. I was born in New Jersey, lived a couple places there, spent some of my childhood in Tennessee, both in central and in western Tennessee. But I grew up for the most part in Southern California and was there through high school. Then I came out here to South Bend, Indiana, went to Notre Dame, and stayed here after, had been working, did my graduate degrees here. So 25 years in South Bend, Indiana.
Wow.
One sentence. Number 2, I'm married. My wife, Lisa, is from 2 places besides here. She was born an early part of her life in Fort Worth, Texas, and then raised in Roanoke, Virginia before coming here. And now sentence 3, we have 6 kids. Our 6 kids are all from South Bend, homegrown Hoosiers. And I spend my time working, teaching at Notre Dame in theology in our McGrath Institute for Church Life.
I love it. I love, you're not the first guest to talk about how they're kind of from everywhere. I think this idea of pilgrimage also, even when guests kind of think about like, where are my roots, it causes them to kind of think about the fact that like, do I have roots and where am I from? But I love that you're from the East Coast and the West Coast and the South and the Midwest.
Right.
I mean, you have it all covered. The 4
I got a
corners.
little bit of sayings from each place, and I don't think I really sound like I'm from any of them. So
I love it.
Yeah.
You're very well rounded.
Okay, thanks.
So your work at Notre Dame at McGrath, and we've talked a little bit about McGrath on the show actually, but what classes do you teach? What are you working on now? We're just about to enter. Well, this will air in the summer, so you have the summer. But what are you working on?
So I've just, finished a year of teaching. I was actually just teaching introductory theology courses this year, which I really like. It's kind of starting from the beginning, which I think is a good place to begin. And this summer, so I guess maybe while folks are listening to this, I'm teaching in our master's program on the Trinity and Christian salvation. A lot of people who are in our ECHO program, they're being formed to be servants in the church. They're in that master's program, or other adults who are interested in becoming more knowledgeable in theology or something to do with their work. They're in that program as well. So that's how I'm spending a good portion of my summer. I'm also helping to develop some initiatives here in our institute. One is related to, something we're going to talk about today, C.S. Lewis, but it's that initiative is called the Inklings Project, where we're working with faculty at a number of different colleges and universities to support them and help them to build and offer courses and other educational offerings for students that relate with the Inklings in some way. So a lot of evangelizing potential in that, especially at public universities where you're not having religious studies, theology courses, and maybe some of the spiritual reflection is not as permitted. I also work on a couple of other projects, our own podcast called Church Life Today, and then something called the Sullivan Family Saints Initiative, where we seek to promote and increase devotion to and scholarship on the saints.
Love it. And we will have links to all of that in the show notes so that you can find out more about Lenny and his work.
Yeah. And I'm doing free
awesome.
advertising today, I guess, for campus ministry and for Under Armour. So
that's right.
This is non-paid. I should send a bill, but
that's right. For those of you watching, you can, free advertising, product placement.
That's right.
Well, as we talk about finding your work, product placement, and your projects, we're going to talk a little bit today about a book that you edited a few years ago called The Chronicles of Transformation, A Spiritual Journey with C.S. Lewis. And I was introduced to the book, I think shortly after I was on your podcast. I was kind of, looking around at what you had done. And my mom and I were getting back into C.S. Lewis. We were reading a book by him. And I love C.S. Lewis. I love the Chronicles, but it had been a while since I read them. And so instead of rereading the Chronicles, which is probably what I should have done, I bought your book, which actually just inspired me to reread them again, which I think is a great compliment to the book.
Yeah, that's the point.
So today I just kind of want to delve into the book and just what prompted the Chronicles of Transformation.
Well, some years ago, we had started this small sort of lecture series in Lent to Easter. And the idea was to gather people together where they would be doing common reading and they would be learning together. But as a sort of liturgical offering, it was also a journey from Lent through Easter. So the first time we did this, we did it with Dante's Divine Comedy, and we offered sort of like public reading groups. We assembled a number of lectures. We organized materials for people so they could read through the Divine Comedy beginning, I think it was Ash Wednesday, and concluding sometime in the Easter season. We did that again with just the book of Exodus, the biblical book of Exodus. And then as a third iteration, we thought, well, let's try and maybe broaden the reach a little bit, bring in some younger people as well. So we did the Chronicles of Narnia for that. So we created this offering where people were intentionally moving together in community in liturgical time and making this journey through these liturgical seasons. Now, part of it was just the idea that we had done that before, right? But what we discovered, I think, in putting this together and really just moving through the Chronicles and having different people speak on them and then conversations with other readers and reading groups is that there is a journey that takes place not only in the Chronicles, but for the readers if we read them in a certain way. And of course, we did have some young people, teenagers, maybe even a little younger who were doing it. But we had a lot of, card-carrying adults who were doing this as well, probably the majority of the audience, both here at Notre Dame and then elsewhere that we were kind of reaching through digital means. And it was sort of, I don't know if it was an epiphany, but it was something that we noticed, that there was a new way of engagement of these Chronicles for adults, but it required things of us as adults, which in some ways is more difficult than the way in which children encounter the Chronicles. Children are just drawn in. Narnia is, I think I write this in the book, Narnia is the children's world. But adults are also drawn into that world if, and only if, they will allow themselves to be somehow childlike again. And it will draw them through this journey. And that childlikeness is not a lack of sophistication. It's kind of post-sophistication. To allow yourself to enjoy, to marvel at, to struggle with, to move in and through these narratives. It's the way children naturally encounter narratives. But sometimes we as adults, we get a little bit too puffed up on our own sophistication and don't let ourselves do that. So this book was really born from that. And it kind of presents that journey, the possibility of that journey to people. It is indeed, as we would talk about, a kind of pilgrimage, a literary pilgrimage, but a spiritual pilgrimage at the same time.
Yeah, I think there's a really good clarification to make, because we talk about the pilgrimage of life. That's what this whole podcast is about. And I think sometimes we just think about growing older, that the pilgrimage of life is growing older and the pilgrimage to heaven. And so we equate like, oh, I'll get holier the longer I live, the more I get to. And I think this challenges that, to say, like, there's a reason Jesus says to become children. And that this pilgrimage of life isn't necessarily because grown-ups, which C.S. Lewis didn't like that term, that grown-ups are necessarily better than children, but that there's this spiritual maturity that doesn't depend on our age. And so the pilgrimage of life cannot just be equated with us growing up.
Yeah. And sometimes it actually works in the reverse direction. So even within the Chronicles themselves, as you would know, a couple of the characters kind of show Lewis's take on this. Like one of the 4 children who enters into Narnia first, Susan, as she grows older, she becomes too, quote unquote, grown up, right? She loses her touch with the things that really matter. She becomes too concerned with and too attached to things that don't matter. these, quote unquote adult concerns. And she loses her. She never can kind of enjoy the Narnian things again. Now, at the same time, you have a child who's pulled into Narnia and is already a boring grown-up in Eustace Scrub, right? And he has to be, in some ways, broken from that, undragoned, if you will.
Yeah.
And that, I think, gives us a little glimpse into the way in which Lewis recognized precisely what you're talking about. It's not simply a linear journey or chronological journey. Like, the older you get, the more mature, the holier, the more spiritual. There is, at the same time as that chronological progression, another sort of level of journey that's taking place. Maybe it's more vertical, or I don't know what it is, how you would describe it, but it does have to do with a conversion, ever-going conversion to humility, to trust, to childlikeness, which is a gospel image that we get, the humility and the trust.
Yeah. I almost wonder if it's almost like a spiral journey into ourselves. Like, if we want to think of the journey as a direction, is it a spiral, not into ourselves in a self-centered, navel-gazing way, but into discovering who we really are and who we were made to be? That sometimes little kids have this, they have a much greater idea of who God made them to be than that adult, And so this spiral pilgrimage into who we are as Christians and who we are in the image and likeness of God, and that discovery of the Lord in that.
I think that's right. And, I think in those terms that you're speaking of, this sort of spiral journey of, say, Teresa of Avila and her interior castle, and, in the outer regions of the castle, of the soul, are all the little critters and all these other things that constantly pull your attention away, that constantly distract you, that make you so disintegrated that you would lose yourself in all the many things. And part of the journey, the spiritual journey she's teaching her sisters and those of us who come after, is the healthy detachment from those things, building up the power, the ability, the capacity for recollection, to be really in one place at one time, which is the initial natural ability upon which those spiritual fruits will build. But you will not discover any of the spiritual fruits of the more inner realms that Teresa talks about if you do not first practice and work on that natural ability of being recollected and detached from the other things. Yeah. And how much is that, apparent in our lives today? Like, all the many ways in which we're constantly poked at and our attention is signaled and grabbed, and how easy it is and enticing and oftentimes minimally rewarding to just split our attention that way and follow the shiny little lights. And it is much harder, perhaps much harder today than ever before, to be recollected, to really be in one place at one time and be fully, fully present. And that is precisely the sort of thing that it takes, not only to be really immersed in a story, you have to yield to the story, but also to be involved in something like a pilgrimage. Like, it is about definite place at definite time, with yourself, with others, and not constantly being pulled to other places and other things, even though those things have a bearing on you where you are.
Yeah. Yeah. We always tell our pilgrims it's about being in the present moment.
Yeah.
And it's about entering into that present moment with nothing else. And that requires detachment, and that requires concentration, and that requires a lot. And I think sometimes we think that little kids have shorter attention spans than we do. But look at a kid reading Narnia. Look at a kid entering into a fantasy world, and they are completely in that world at that moment.
Yeah.
And it's not us and our maturity that have longer attention spans than our children. Sometimes it's them able to completely enter into the story.
They don't need a payoff for it, right? Like, they don't have to make something of it, analyze it, get the point, find the message, make it useful. They can just enjoy it. Just be there, or be troubled by it, or be sucked into it, or not stop thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love in your essay in the book that you speak about your son first reading it, and we get to live it through him. And because, I read them as a child, but I don't have a clear memory of reading them as a child, except for the first one that I think grabbed me the most. But when I read them as adults, I already knew the story, and I was reading it as an adult, and it's very different. And so I love that you told us how Isaac experienced it so that we could kind of experience it as kids again.
Yeah, I mean, and part of this has to do with the central figure of Aslan himself, let's say. Like those of us who come to the Chronicles of Narnia as adults, and especially if we know something about him beforehand, we are already hip to the fact that Aslan is a Christ figure, right?
Yes.
He is going to exhibit some of those characteristics. He's going to present them to us, and we're looking for them and we're anticipating them. And when there's all kinds of spoilers in this episode, folks. So
yes.
just so you know. So, when he's taken off to be sacrificed, and it's coming, you're not surprised in a way that it's coming. You don't feel it because of course he's going to be sacrificed. And when he appears again on the horizon, you're not that surprised. Of course he's going to rise. But that is precisely when I was awakened to the difference between my son Isaac, who was then 5, and myself encountering this story. I obviously had already read it. I knew it was going to happen, but I'm just not surprised by that kind of narrative arc anymore.
Yeah.
He was utterly devastated and utterly delighted.
Yeah.
And there's something in that, not just about Narnia, but about the Christian mystery. Like we've become too domesticated to the fact that, he will enter into his passion and die and rise again. And we just move, blithely from one to the other because this is the way it goes. And we have to be shocked by that over and over again, even though we know it. And I think that's part of the spiritual discipline that adults can reacquire by yielding to something like a children's story of Narnia, which isn't just for children.
Yeah. Yes. When I teach adults Lectio Divina, it's kind of my big thing is we have to be doing more Lectio Divina as a church. And I always tell people you have to try to read it like you've never heard it before. Whether it's a parable, like a man who had 2 sons. I don't care that you know where this is going. Act like you've never heard it. And like that Jesus became man, that God became man. Act like you've never, like, that's crazy. And we're, as a church, we're just like, oh yeah, God became man. Okay, going on with my day. No, that's insane. That's insanity. But we're so used to it, and we need to become like little kids and be surprised by it again.
You should protest against it. This is not the way this works. Like, what do you mean God became man? I'm putting this book down for quite some time until I can come to terms with that. That's ridiculous. Yeah,
exactly. The scandal of the incarnation, Irenaeus would say, right? So, all 7 of the books include a type of journey, really, and often a physical journey. And I think there's this idea that we connect to this image, this story, that it's an image we can relate to. But this physical journey is, of course, indication of a spiritual journey. And that's like pilgrimage, right? Like we can connect to this physical pilgrimage. We get that image, but it really is speaking about the interior journey. And so I love that Lewis uses these adventures to that's something we can cling on to. But the real story is that interior journey for the characters throughout the series.
Yeah, and I think this is part of Lewis's great incarnational instinct, which is that the practical and the spiritual are not separated. But in Christianity, that which is most practical is the place where you will find the deepest spiritual meaning. And that which is most spiritual is that which is going to be rendered through the practical matters. So by traversing this terrain, by taking seriously the challenges and the conquests of Narnia, by undergoing the various tests, by having character tried, by the choices that you make in these specific situations, that's where the spiritual quality and the virtues are really being forged. And it's not over and above that or elsewhere. It's right in the middle of that. And in some ways, I think, or in many ways, I think that Narnia, therefore, is not like a metaphor for our world. It's not, a one-to-one allegory of our world. It's in some ways a training ground, a practice for what it means to live in this world well, to reckon with the matters of responsibility and the crises of character in practical matters, because that is the very terrain that our Lord and Savior took on as his own. That's where the spiritual stuff happens. And we see this again, like elsewhere in Lewis's corpus, like, for example, in that marvelous little book, The Great Divorce. The terrain itself is like a character. It's almost the whole thing. that reality is harsh to the feet of shadows, it says, therefore, and the ghosts who come into the heavenly terrain have to become accommodated to that terrain. They have to be thickened. And it's happening to them, it seems somewhat physically, but it's happening to them in their passions, in their desires, in their affections, in their values, and in their loves. And so that which is most interior is actually affecting them exteriorly. And the terrain, which seems exterior, is actually the proving ground for what's inside. I think this is taking place all throughout Lewis's fiction, especially. And we see that all throughout the Chronicles of Narnia. The engagement with the world, the terrain, the crises matters absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the idea of like, this isn't just a story, but this is a like you said, a training ground for us. Where are the lessons to then take into our everyday life? Where, how, like the characters, we all know Peters, we all know Edmonds, we all know Eustaces. Maybe we are them, and how, like, we are called to go now live the life with them and take these lessons of conversion, of redemption, of atonement into our life. And that's the reality. And really the spirituality, like, this is Great Divorce, right? The spiritual life is the greater reality. That's the greater reality than ever what we can see and touch.
Yes.
But that discovery, we're going to have to do a series on just pilgrimage in literature, and you're going to have to do all the episodes, and we can have an episode on the Great Divorce, an episode on Dante, and so it'll be great. So I'll sign you up now. I think one of the great themes for me, especially in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but I think in all the things, is that theme of discovery, where Lucy discovers Narnia first. Yeah. And we don't have to get on the rant, but I agree with you on the proper order of reading the books, that you read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe first, because you need to discover with Lucy Narnia, and you need to discover. But this theme of discovery, I think, can also connect to pilgrimage, that pilgrimages help us discover not just the world, but then also ourselves. And so I think we see this theme of discovery throughout all 7 stories, that is that discovery of pilgrimage.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think, like you're rightly saying, the characters are discovering themselves, but that's oftentimes comes belatedly. They don't just go into a corner and like think about themselves, right? You're not saying this. Indeed, it's going into and through this journey that they come to these moments of struggle and of self-confrontation. And often the self-confrontation is the confrontation with, or the encounter with, Aslan or his mission, right? So you can think about Lucy, who, as you rightly said, is the first one drawn into Narnia and discovers the land, but she really comes to the crisis of herself, most likely in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, when she's reading through, I forget what the book's called, the book that contains all stories, and her character is being tried there, and she has to be converted into the greater acceptance of her story and her greater love for Aslan, and letting go of some of these attachments that she might otherwise have. It's in a, probably the most quasi mystical of the Chronicles, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's like surrounded by a lot of humor, but that particular trial that Lucy undergoes is a trial indeed, or the trial when she has to wake up her siblings in Prince Caspian. It's a terrible task because she's got to tell them they've gone the wrong way. She knows this is painful, but her obedience to her call forces it upon her. Either she does that or she's abandoning herself in some way. And so that discovery of self is coming from these tasks, again, from the place itself, from the one who calls you there. And you don't know in advance where those discoveries are going to come from, at what point, with whom, with what. You have to actually go and be open to discover it.
To live life, to live the life in front of you.
Yeah, that's nice.
Because, I think, it is this idea of nowadays, like, I'm going to go off and discover myself, right? Yep. And you have people walking the Camino, for example, to go discover themselves. And it's like, okay, actually, you're not really looking to discover yourself. You're looking to discover your maker. And in discovering God, you're going to discover yourself. But that's an important, I think, difference, that the characters aren't setting off to discover themselves, but that they discover themselves through the living of daily life and the obedience to their mission. And I think that's a really important clarification.
Yeah. And even right from the beginning, like the one who goes in looking for something for himself is on the wrong journey. And that would be Edmund at the beginning, right? He's going to grasp something. He's trying to elevate himself. And first of all, he suffers the terrible consequences of that personally, and then sees the consequences of his actions on others. But he has to be broken from that. And it's when he himself is converted to a mission that he actually really discovers who he is, and his, not just his role and his place, but also his dignity and his strength.
Yeah. It's a good reminder to us that even those people who embark on these missions for the wrong reason, like Edmund enters Narnia for the wrong reason. He begins on the wrong foot, but there's still redemption. There's still salvation because of his willingness. And really because in a sense, when he gets taken by the White Witch, it's that death to self. Like, he's in a bad spot, and it's that his siblings' willingness to sacrifice themselves for him, and then obviously Aslan's sacrifice in the best sense. But this might be a really difficult question, but of your seven, what's your favorite?
For a while it was The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, just because of that sort of more mystical quality. I had a renewed love of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, actually, as I was first developing the lecture that then turned into the chapter I wrote for this book. Because I was organizing the whole thing, I just left myself to the end if I was going to do one, whatever one people don't pick, and nobody picked Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, right? So I ended up with that one. But I really came to love it in a new and deeper way. And it was precisely by the way I tried to write about it. Like, this was my renewed encounter with it. So there is something about that I love. But I mean, I do enjoy each of them. And, not to sort of shamelessly plug this book, but the contributors to this volume, like what they wrote on each one, was really educational for me and eye-opening. Like, I had never encountered The Horse and His Boy the way that Francesca Murphy leads us to encounter that. And it was so revelatory. I'd read it, several times, and I just saw more deeply into it and made it more delightful. Or the way in which, for example, Anthony Pagliarini spoke about and really taught about the misuse of language in The Last Battle, and the redemption of language, and the struggle for truth, and all that stuff. It's totally eye-opening, I thought. Yeah. So I came to a renewed appreciation for them in that way. But to answer your question directly, maybe pick The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Yeah, I love it. That's a hard question.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to choose, because in a sense they're all very different. And I think at different times of our lives, probably different ones speak to us. I've always loved The Horse and His Boy in that, and this is a big spoiler, just that image of Aslan showing up in so many different ways. Yeah. I think we can all relate to that in our lives, where the Lord is unrecognizable sometimes, and sometimes the Lord even shows up in ways that we wish he hadn't, and then we realize, oh, I'm so glad that happened, right? And so that is such an important part of our lives and our spiritual journey and our relationship with the Lord. But I loved when Francesca talked about that, like, at face value, that story is really, it seems to be just an escape. He's escaping, but it really is this pilgrimage for Shasta to discover who he is. Again, that idea of self-journey, or it's self-discovery, but in just this everyday, he's escaping. Yeah. And in the end, it's a pilgrimage to discover Aslan and discover who he is, like in so many of the other stories. Yeah. And she even says, like, pilgrimage is this natural desire of our lives that Shasta doesn't know he's on a pilgrimage. But I think she really opened up for me too. Even though The Horse and His Boy is one of my favorites, she opened up a really new sense of it for me.
Yeah, and I think she drew to our attention that preceding even his need to escape, which that need came pretty early. He realized his peril, that he had to leave where he was. Even before that, there was the desire for the North, the curiosity about the North. Yes. The North was calling to him. Yeah. And I think you can quickly, when you're getting into the story, trying to figure out what's going on, and here you get to the beginning of the drama, you forget what preceded it, and that's what preceded it, his desire for the North. And what Francesca does so brilliantly is she helps us to see that this was, in many ways, a reflection of Lewis's own desire and journey. She reads The Horse and His Boy, especially next to Surprised by Joy, Lewis's own autobiography, and makes the claim she thinks The Horse and His Boy is the most autobiographical of all of Lewis's chronicles, that it was his desire for joy, and he had a very particular meaning for joy, this unfulfilled longing, this sort of pain, this piercing, that propelled him forward even against himself. And that, I think, she sees as the primary motivation for Shasta, too, which is really the desire that's coming from Aslan himself, unnamed and as yet unknown.
Yes. That really, and again, that idea of that pilgrimage, that interior desire, that there's something calling us. And you do meet people who go on physical pilgrimages and they don't even know why, but there's this desire. I think we see it in some people's lives just in wanderlust. Like they have this desire to go and travel, and they don't realize what they're searching for, but I think they're searching for something other than themselves. They're searching for that meaning. They're searching for that desire. And that, like, I love what you said, like, propels us forward, that desire for the North, for Aslan, for heaven. Something is calling us. And so I think that's, again, like a good pilgrimage connection, that there's this interior desire to move. And that's our spiritual pilgrimage. The spiritual pilgrimage of life is that desire to go, maybe outside of ourselves, but to go to that thing. I mean, that thing that's going to complete us, right? Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Yeah. And for some of us, it's that wanderlust and that desire to physically pilgrimage. But on that pilgrimage, we pray that people find the North, find Aslan, find the Lord.
Yeah, and I think this is the good news of dissatisfaction, actually. Like, maybe we call it the gospel of dissatisfaction. No, that's not right. But good news of dissatisfaction. Yeah. So long as you are dissatisfied, there's actually a nugget of something very good in that, which is it's the flip side, the indication that there's something more you desire, that you're made for more. The real tragedy and sadness would be just blanket contentment at any point, right? This isn't to just crave after being unsettled, but we are created to desire, and not to douse our desires, not to even tame them, but actually to allow them to grow and to be enlarged, to be directed and ordered. And we will desire more and more the closer we get to our Lord. And so I think, maybe the most prevalent, or one of the most prevalent conditions and feelings of people today is a persistent feeling of dissatisfaction, of disconnection, of not knowing what's wrong, but wanting something else. And maybe we could think about that as, in a way, it's a slow motion and silent tragedy, but in another way, it is the silent throbbing of some good news. Like, this isn't it for you. There is something else, and seek something else.
Yeah. And that can be that little door opening that the Lord needs. That in our comfort, it's if our, like you said, like if we're too comfortable and we're too content, we're not going to search. I was thinking actually about this recently when I was confronted with the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul speaks at Athens and everyone's like, oh, okay, we'll hear you about this on another time. And then he goes to Corinth. And you would think like Athens is academic, they're intellectual, they're seeking the truth, whereas Corinth is pretty vicious. I mean, they're full
Lewd.
Of sexual immorality, they're lewd, right? So you'd think, oh, the better audience would be Athens. But no, he leaves Athens to go to Corinth. And I thought,
that's great.
I wonder if Corinth makes the better converts, because they are searching. Like that lasciviousness is never going to fill their needs, and so they are searching, whereas Athens can be like, oh well, we have our philosophy and we have our answers, and like it's a fascinating, like, God works in ways I can't understand sometimes, but is it that contentment that is actually bad because we stop searching?
Nothing spoils the taste of good ordinary food quite so much as bad magic food, which Lewis says in the first chronicle, right? And in this case, like it may or may not be bad magic food, but it might be, tasty little philosophical discourse, and it might be a pleasant and cordial life, and it might be a comfortable neighborhood and a good enough routine. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard for me. It's hard for all of us when we get into those places because they are so nice to want to shake out of them. But one of the things I learned from, say, Mother Teresa, I think one of the secrets to her holiness was her willingness to leave happiness to find joy. She left home, which she described as a very happy home, but she left home to go first to Ireland and then to India. And she probably wasn't ever going to get back to that home, to her happy home. And when she was in India initially, and she was a sister of Loreto, she said she's never been happier than when she was a sister of Loreto. She loved her community. She loved her work. She loved educating in the way that she was educating. But when the call came to her to leave where she was and to go seek the poorest of the poor, there was a real price to be paid in that. And it was the price of happiness, to go seek that joy. And it came with a lot of struggle and pain, but there was transformation in the end. And that transformation was not what she was looking for or expected. It looked like a lot of loneliness and abandonment, but it was all within, it seemed, the crucible of becoming ever more fit for fuller joy.
Yeah. And that's what and I again, to bring it back to pilgrimage, that idea of like people go on the Camino not to suffer, but you're going to suffer, you're going to be stretched. We were joking on this podcast earlier that we need a better marketing slogan if our slogan is come on pilgrimage to suffer. But at the same time, like, we are so comfortable as Americans, we have to step outside of that in order, in a sense, to leave happiness to find joy sometimes, whether that's putting ourselves in an uncomfortable place, putting ourselves in a place that stretches us, that just takes us out of our comfort zone a little bit, in order to find joy. I think there's something really powerful there.
Yeah. And sometimes that's going with other people, right? Like,
yes.
This is not going to go exactly the way you want it. There will be sometimes compromises, sometimes things you just have to give up. Scheduling is not going to be always right. It's hard to move groups of people. Best laid plans, they just don't come through, right? And that too is part of the pilgrimage.
Absolutely.
Like, that too is kind of a yielding and a being more docile and more responsive to what's coming towards you. It has to do with the rocks on the ground, and it has to do with the interruptions in the schedule, both of them at the same time.
Yes. So often we ignore the crosses we're supposed to carry because they look too ordinary. They look like, I want some grand, like, big blister as I'm walking across the arid Camino, and I want the Camino, blah, blah, blah. But then if I go to Rome with a bus full of people and they're annoying me, that's not what I want, right? Like,
don't want this roommate.
I don't see exactly like the bus is late, or the tour guide didn't show up. Like, I don't want that sacrifice. And so we waste all the sacrifices and the crosses that the Lord gives us because they look too ordinary. Yeah. And we want this dramatic, pilgrimage. And it's like, what about all the little things? I mean, that's our daily life too, right? Like, I don't want that coworker or that, snoring spouse. I want, but that's what we're called. That's what we're called to. So
that's right. That's great.
I have a very important question as we wrap up. Why Turkish delight? It's bothered me since I was little. Have you ever had Turkish delight?
Well, it's
disgusting.
I was actually just in Turkey. I had Turkish. Sorry.
Is it better in Turkey?
I have never been able to say that before. Like, this is my first time there. The Turkish delight we had was
when I was in Turkey last week.
It was actually incredible. Which I've also had Turkish delight. I had it, I think once somebody brought it to a meeting. And it was awful. Like, I just thought it was terrible. But there's like all different kinds of varieties of Turkish delight and this stuff. So what we had in this little Turkish market, I didn't buy any, but they gave us some, was really lovely and delightful. So.
Okay, that makes me feel better. That's always bothered me because I've had it and I was like, really, Edmund, for this? Really?
Yeah, this is you give. Yeah, your soul
for
is
ice
worth
cream,
the whole
maybe,
world, but for whales.
Yeah, exactly.
For whales.
It's like, maybe that's what C.S. Lewis was trying to tell us.
That's right.
But okay, that makes me feel better. That when you were humble brag in Turkey last week. You had better Turkish delight. So, is there anything you'd like to add, or anything you want to say before we wrap up? Anything maybe we missed? I mean, there's a ton we missed, because these are 7 magnificent books, along with, I would say, your book is the 8th. I would really recommend it to people.
Oh, wow.
I would say, like, go back to the Chronicles if you haven't read them since you were little. If you've never read them, go back to the Chronicles and read this as a companion. Read Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then read Lenny's essay. And yeah, it's spiritual reading. It is fantastic. Thanks. So thanks for giving this gift to us. But yeah, is there anything that we missed?
No, I mean, I love what you said right from the beginning, that like you first of all picked up this book instead of the Chronicles, but it led you back to the Chronicles. And as we say, or as I write in the introduction to the volume, that's in very many ways what we wanted to do. It's not about analyzing the Chronicles. It's about learning to enjoy them again. And we, those of us who have written about this, have done some of the work of analyzing, but only because we enjoyed them first. And so like what we do to help maybe readers see a little bit more, position themselves a little bit more, is really to the end of learning how to enjoy again. But I'd also say, I think a couple of the things that are distinctive about that volume are, first of all, the original illustrations that are there from our friend and colleague, Stephen Baraney. He created an original illustration for each of the 7 Chronicles. And those, I think, deserve not only to be enjoyed on their own, but almost studied on their own. Like, they're really insightful and profound illustrations that he gave us. And then alongside those, there's an original poem cycle that runs throughout the volume as well by Madeline Lewis Infantine. She wrote an original poem for each of the 7 Chronicles, and they are not only delightful, but profound and insightful and lyrical in a really astounding way. So, there's a lot of things that have been written about Lewis and about the Chronicles. And if we were going to do something else on this, we were going to have, our essays on each of the Chronicles, which we thought added something. But these 2 pieces of art, the collection of illustrations and the poem cycle, were yet another way in which we wanted to offer something different and new.
They're beautiful. It's such a fun way to return to these really well-beloved stories and see them. And again, not like dissect them in a way, but just to enjoy them more and just to return to them. So
that's right.
It's really delightful.
That's right.
Listeners, I hope this has helped you see kind of that the idea of pilgrimage can be present in a lot of different ways. Maybe after listening to many episodes of this podcast, I hope that your eyes are kind of open to the idea that this image of journey, this image of discovery, this image of pilgrimage is in our lives in a lot of different ways. And we can see it because it really is this natural desire of the heart pulling us to the north. And so whether we see that in literature, we see it in movies, we see it in liturgy, we can see our lives really being directed towards this greater journey, this greater spiritual, this greater pilgrimage of life. So thanks for joining us, Lenny. This was great.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
And again, in the show notes, you'll find how to get this book, how to find more out about Lenny's projects. And we hope you share this with another friend, maybe someone who has read the Chronicles. And maybe this is another way for them to find out about pilgrimage through this lens. So thanks for listening. God bless.